Well, yeah, I got familiar with Zoom through, teaching at my university. And so it occurred to me, and I sent out an email to 5 or 6 friends. Did they think it was a good idea that we had a reunion? And they did. And so it's been going, guys. How long? I think 2 years. Almost 2 years. Yeah.
Couple of years.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Okay, so welcome everyone. We have a good turnout tonight because we have Kathy Stephens, who generously agreed to join us today. And I think most of you know about Kathy, but she was a K-35, I think, and was the first returned Peace Corps volunteer and Korean-speaking ambassador to Korea in 2008 or something like that. And in fact, living here in Seoul at least twice, I was able to go to the embassy at get-togethers for Peace Corps volunteers that Kathy organized, which was really, really nice, because otherwise it's not so easy to just walk into the embassy environment, anymore. So anyway, Kathy's here, and thanks. And I meant to add that Kathy's the president and the CEO of Korea Economic Institute. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so I'm going to record this. Ned Schultz isn't here yet to remind me. Oh, I already started.
You already started.
It's recording. It's recording. Okay, so let me switch the view here to speaker.
I want to keep seeing all of you.
Well, you can, Kathy, can you see some of us now? Most of us?
I think I see all of you. I mean,
Okay, good. So I'm just doing it for the recording.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, so Kathy, thanks for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, Frank, thank you. And yeah, it's great to see all of you. I confess I have not prepared any slides or speech or anything like that. And I really would like to just have a conversation. I guess we have about an hour or however long you want. I'm just kind of curious, how many of you are in Korea? Nobody.
Frank is there.
Frank is in Korea. He's the only one. Okay, I just he's going to be my fact checker or something, at least if I make. And then everyone else is somewhere in the Hawaii or parts east or west or whatever. Okay.
Bobby's in Japan.
And Japan. Okay, great.
And
Well,
I'm in Korea for a month.
Who?
Carl, Carl Moskowitz.
Yes, I'm
Carl,
not Peace Corps 1. I'm a guest.
Right. All right. Well, the legendary, all the rest of us, bow down to the K1. So thank you for inviting me. We've all been so Koreanized. When Frank asked me to do this, I thought it sounded great, but I said I didn't really. And then I found out everyone else, so you had like people preparing slides and lectures, and I just can't do that on a Saturday night. I really would love to just talk with you about anything about Korea or not Korea you want to talk about. I mean, I guess I thought I would focus a little bit on, as I think Frank sent around to you, on the fact that Korea inaugurated a new president last week. There's going to be a meeting between that new president, President Yoon Suk-yeol, and President Biden next week, at the end of next week, about exactly a week from today in Seoul. And so this is an easy, well, even if I'm out of government, it's even easier for me to kind of talk about what the election might mean for Korea and U.S.-Korean relations. But underlying all that is the fact that I think like some of the rest of you in all our different ways, I mean, I have a deep and abiding interest in all things Korean, but my own sort of history with Korea included 6 years, and I knew some of you then, I think, in the 1980s in Korea, not as a Peace Corps volunteer. That's what I'm kind of famous for in Korea, is having been a Peace Corps volunteer. And of course, I'm proud to wear that badge. But I was a far more suspicious sounding political officer at the American Embassy in the 1980s, from 1983 until 1989, at a time of enormous political change and kind of had a front row seat for that, and in some ways, and it gave me just a really abiding interest in Korea's own political journey. And so I continue to follow that now with the latest election. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, and yeah, and sort of take it there. But again, I'd rather do it. And someone said you have hard questions. I mean, all questions, the easiest questions are usually the hardest ones or whatever, you know, but I just love talking about this with people who share, I think as we all do, an interest in kind of what's going on and trying to understand Korea and its politics and its society. And I guess for KEI, and I know some of you have tuned into a few things that KEI did on the election, including, and I would make I know Ed Baker has written me about it, and I'm sorry, it still is so hard to get onto some of our podcasts, but one of the nice things about the, there were not too many nice things to say about the pandemic and all of that, but when we did move to this Zoom format, just as you're having these meetings like this, we started interviewing more people from Korea, and indeed even Koreans who don't speak English or choose not to speak it in doing interviews. And I met up first online and then met him in person last December when I was in Korea. A terrific Korean political analyst named Park Sung Min. And did two interviews with him, and have borrowed shamelessly from him in his analysis in thinking about Korean politics, not only as they are now, but kind of how we got to where we are now. But anyway, I'm still just doing a lot of throat clearing here, but I thought even before I got to all that, I would tell you about what I was doing the last couple of days, because I just came back from New York. I was in New York the last couple of days for a couple of things, both Korea related, or two Korea related. And one was just a reminder to me, I thought, of how much, we could always, think, gosh, how much things have changed. But this was a gala dinner of the Korean American Community Foundation, KACF. And, certainly among the many, many things that we see, of course, is this extraordinary growth and in every sense of the word, I guess you always, of the Korean American community, its reach into American society, into global society, and its influence. And this dinner really kind of brought all that together of, I think, what sometimes Korean Americans call the second generation of Korean Americans. I mean, those whose maybe, to generalize in a way, many of whose parents came here while we were in the Peace Corps. There was that kind of wave of immigration of Koreans coming in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, the United States, and oftentimes, whatever their educational backgrounds were, opening up the small shops and working quite hard to get a foothold in American society. And then, of course, being Koreans, having extraordinary expectations of their children. And now these children are in their 40s and 50s with the next generation coming along. And it's just kind of mind-blowing to see all these people get together in New York. And what they were doing, and a lot of these people have pretty deep pockets, was raising money, kind of trying to introduce the notion of philanthropy, I suppose you'd say, the American tradition, into supporting vulnerable Korean American and Asian American communities. And I've said, in one night, they raised $4 million as we sat there, which is pretty crazy. And we had everyone from the star of Squid Games to the producer of Lee Jae-jung, is it? Lee Jung-jae, I'm still bet, and the producer of Parasite, Mickey Lee, all rubbing shoulders with some titans from Wall Street, and raising money for still very vulnerable communities, as we all know, of Asian American and Korean American communities and others around the country, and all at the same time reflecting on the universal messages that Koreans have somehow communicated in their mass culture with films like Parasite and Squid Games about Korean society today and American society today. But anyway, that's all to say. I'd love to talk about all that with you, but to move to what I said I was going to talk about and say just a word about the election. I know some of you followed it very closely, but to the election and kind of where we are now. First of all, I said I'd say something about the state of Korean democracy, and I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I think the state of democracy throughout the world is pretty worrisome, and Korea certainly has its challenges too. But all that given, there's some things that I think we can recognize and celebrate. And one is the fact that Korea did a month ago, or 2 months ago, I guess it was in March, have an election for president. It's I think I may get my dates wrong, is it the 10th? Some of you will know this. You know, I think it's I should have done the math on this. The 10th election since 1987. I was in Korea in 1987 when the first election was held under the new constitution, which allowed for the direct election of the president, achieved after the large protests in the streets, first led by the students, then joined by everyone else. And indeed, that was part of what I witnessed and some of you may have witnessed as well if you were living in Korea at the time. It was an extraordinary, turnaround from where Korea had been a few years ago with the brutal suppression of the democracy movement in 1980. And again, that's a whole thing we could talk about why 1980 was different than 1987, and maybe even if American policy was any different, if that made any difference. But I just put that out there if anyone wants to talk about that. But in any event, that election in 1987, of course, splitting the vote between the two Kims, and then No Tae-woo coming to power, and having, in a sense, then this rather soft transition to democracy, I guess you could say, because it was a transition to sort of this quasi-ruling party. And then, of course, finally, with the election of Kim Dae-jung, 3 election cycles later, the first real transfer of power to another party. I'm already going down a lot of rabbit holes, which I guess I'll do all evening. Not really rabbit holes, but there's so much texture to all of this. But in any event, rolling right up to in March, we had again the presidential election held under the same constitution, which has not been amended since then, since 1987. 1-term, 5-year term. Koreans, the lesson that the Koreans took from the Park Chung-hee years, of course, was that the great evil of politics was Changi Chungkwan, too long in power, and so no one was going to stay for a second term. It's brought its own downsides, of course, as we've seen with 1 term, but in any event, one guy's out, and it's a pretty brutal system, and new ones come in. And in the election in March, notwithstanding the fact that the 2 candidates were both considered unlikables, dislikables, it was called, gloomy election. Notwithstanding all that, Korea had a turnout of 77%, which is pretty extraordinary. The votes were counted remarkably quickly, and no real disputes at all about it. The margin of victory between the winning and losing candidate was 0.7%, less than 1%. I think less, about 250,000 votes. But the losing candidate, Lee Jae-myung, who was the governor, of course, of Gyeonggi province, came out and conceded immediately in a very gracious way. And a few hours later, Yoon Suk-yeol, who had won, came out and gave a gracious acceptance speech. And I guess all those things are used to be, I used to think of them as givens in democracy. We realize they're not, but they happen in Korea. And I think it's worth kind of dwelling on that for a moment before we talk about all the problems there are. But it was a resounding, I think, vote by the Korean people and their own belief in their democracy, notwithstanding many dissatisfactions and problems that there are. So anyway, Yoon Suk-yeol was elected by this very narrow margin. It was a very, we use the word polarized a lot everywhere in the world now, but certainly it was used a lot in Korea, very polarized. But polarized not so in ways that are a little bit different than back in the day, whether we're talking about the 60s or 70s when they really weren't. Well, in the 60s they had some elections, but when Park Chung-hee didn't like them, he just kind of ignored them, right, and introduced the Yushin Constitution. But in any event, polarized not so much over things like region or even ideology, but more generation. And also to some extent gender, especially among the younger generation. And again, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But a sense that that Yoon has come to office with, I would say, not a very strong or clear mandate, and also, of course, as a person who has no clear, I would say, political coloration himself. For those of you who haven't read much about him, he was a career prosecutor, very kind of classic, I guess, middle class aspiration of parents who I think were professionals of some kind. He went to Seoul National University and in the law school, and then he took 9 years before he passed the bar exam. So when he finally did, he became a prosecutor, and he was a prosecutor for successive administrations. Actually sent essentially Park Geun-hye to jail, who, by the way, was freed and then showed up at the inauguration. So Korean politics is filled with all kinds of drama and ironies, I suppose. But in any event, was kind of, as someone, I was explaining this, or trying to explain in a little bit more succinctly to a friend of mine a few months ago, as the election was going on, who didn't know Korea. And as I was describing Yoon Suk-yeol being a prosecutor and what he'd done in terms of working for the Moon Jae-in administration initially against the previous government, because as you all know, I mean, a good feature of Korean politics is kind of, retribution. Well, retribution is a negative word, but rectification of past ills, right? Which sometimes means throwing everybody else who just lost office into jail, or banishing them to, banish them to Honam anymore, but banish them somewhere, sometimes to Harvard, but at least for a while. But in any event, so this person was saying to me, as I described Yoon Suk-yeol, he said, it sounds like they had Jim Comey run for president. And I said, well, yeah, kind of, I guess, But in any event, so Mr. Yoon won the presidency. He's never run for office. He had never run for office before. He did not run a particularly good campaign. He did some things which I think were really unfortunate. I mentioned the gender divide. He really tapped into a lot of kind of backlash against the Me Too movement and women's rights in Korea among young men, in a very explicit way, and kind of rode that to gaining some of those votes, because the young people were considered to be kind of the swing votes. But comes to office with no foreign policy experience, no running a kind of organization experience. So we'll see. And I'm not sure he really has much of an ideological kind of cast. So all that said, he was inaugurated last week. He talked a lot about the values of freedom, about a close relationship with the United States, about being tough on North Korea, but leaving the door open to helping North Korea if it did the right things. So a fairly traditional, if you like, kind of conservative message. But it's and brought in a team that is identified, I think, with that message more or less. But I am among those who think that his room for maneuver is not very great. And in many ways, I think that there's less difference between the kind of policies he'll pursue in foreign policy. There's less difference in foreign policy between what he will pursue and what Moon Jae-in pursued. And again, the kind of most of the chattering class in Washington think, oh, he's a conservative, he's pro-American, it's going to be much easier. We're still working with some of the same real difficulties that Korea has always had, exacerbated, of course, by the geopolitical tensions of rising China, war in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So he's got a team, he's come to office, and we'll see how he does. He still has a National Assembly that is in the hands of the Democratic Party, the Minju-dong, the opposition party. I don't think that poses as much of a challenge on foreign policy as some people would suggest, but nonetheless, politics will still loom large. And I guess the other thing I would mention is, I'm trying to kind of lay the landscape here a little bit, is Korea has actually more elections coming up June 1st, so in 2 weeks. And that, of course, are the so-called the local elections. Well, not so-called, they are the local elections, but the elections for mayors of the major cities, governors of the provinces, and even some of the, I think, the county chiefs and so on run. And again, all of us old timers will remember that, Korea was classically the most centralized state sort of anywhere kind of thing. And there was no local autonomy, but the implementation of local autonomy was a part of democratization that came fairly late. It's still not, Korea is still a highly centralized government. It's not a federal or a confederal kind of model. And the local governors and mayors don't have a lot of, for example, fundraising, taxing power, but it is increasingly a place from which rising politicians are drawn until they get ensnared in, sexual harassment scandals or construction, corruption scandals, or a lot of other things. It did catch a lot of the Minju-dong politicians earlier on, but these elections are important, and they'll be very interesting to see. And in fact, the losing candidate, Lee Jae-myung, from the presidential election is running for a National Assembly seat, or a by-election for an empty National Assembly seat on June 1st. So politics will continue to bubble in Korea, which is not a bad thing. But Yoon will have, I think, some trouble really establishing his footing early on. I think what's really going to consume, and I'll get back to foreign policy and US-Korean relations in a minute, but really going to consume Yoon early on, of course, is, and this is true of most of our countries now, I suppose, is dealing with, I guess, what I call domestic issues, although Korea is so trade dependent, the economy is so dependent on the global economic situation, you can't really divorce that entirely from the state of the world and the ability of Korea to kind of maneuver within that, to say nothing of North Korea. But all that said, the big issues in the election were, and I know most of you or many of you know this, was high real estate prices, especially in Seoul, the perceived drying up, this has gone on for some time, or the lack of upward opportunities for upward mobility for young Koreans who are, as always, overeducated and with at least parents who are very, very ambitious for what they do, and a sense that inequality, some of these things I'm very familiar in our own country too, of course, that inequality has grown, and that now more than ever, absent connections, money, a step up, you're not going to be able to make it. So dealing with a lot of I think social unease, dissatisfaction, and economic anxiety. That notwithstanding, of course, Korea has done relatively well throughout the pandemic. And one thing I would really flag in terms of its economy, and it's got to deal with the fact that relations with China are rocky and will probably continue to be very difficult to manage for all the reasons we know, but we can talk about. But it's still very important to the economy, and of course, China still being essentially kind of locked down itself for large parts of it because of the pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty there. But one issue, and this will bring me back to now the Biden-Yoon visit here, or meeting in 2 weeks time, or next week actually, is the fact that Korea, we think of shipbuilding and cars, and I mean all the various products that Korea is now so famous for, but semiconductors, South Korea is now, along with Taiwan, the two major sources of semiconductors that, in particular, the US, and if you like, the rest of what we now call the rules-based order, or the, we don't say the free world anymore, or the democratic order, really want to have as part of these so-called secure supply chains. In other words, not have supply chains going through China, right? So the fact that South Korea and Taiwan right now really do manufacture these semiconductors, which it turns out we need for everything, right? For all those Stinger missiles going to Ukraine, and for all those Kia cars that we all want to buy this year, and everything else. They're all made by Korean firms. So that has really, I think, given Korea some leverage. But also given it some sort of challenges as to how it sort of maneuvers this in a time where some of these kind of what used to be just more economic or technology issues are really intertwined with, or at the heart of I guess what we consider to be the national security issues. So when President Biden does travel to Asia next week, it will be his first visit to Asia since becoming president. Koreans are making much of the fact that this is, I mean, again, in Korea, it's always you want to be the earliest, the first, or whatever, but as we do, but this is the earliest that an American president and a new Korean president, or the earliest in a new Korean president's term that there's been a summit, and Biden's coming out for it. So that in itself is certainly a sign of respect, and is being taken as that, and is a very good thing. It has been, I think, I don't know if it's officially announced, but it's been, it's widely believed that President Biden, while he's in Korea, in addition to having his summit with President Yoon, will also meet with the outgoing president, Moon Jae-in, which I think is a very nice sign and a gracious thing to do, to, again, kind of indicate that the United States, notwithstanding, again, what the aforementioned Washington chattering class sometimes says, that Washington does not sort of rely only on the Conservative Party now in power to manage the relationship, but recognizes that there's a broad political spectrum and a lively political debate going on in Korea. So he's going to see Moon Jae-in, which would be good. There's rumors that he's going to make a speech at a university, perhaps at Ewha Women's University. I kind of get the sense that, and I would support this, I guess, obviously, that the Americans kind of want to make a point about women's rights in Korea, because this became such a scratchy, well, worse than scratchy issue during the campaign. I noticed that when I've forgotten his name now, the second gentleman, as we call him, Vice President Harris's husband led the delegation to the inauguration, and made a point of doing a tour around some market in Seoul with a leader of the LGBTQ community in Seoul, and the Korean press took that very much as a sign that the U.S. was trying to show the Yoon administration that it was watching closely to see how the Yoon administration approaches issues of diversity and human rights. But in any event, with the summit, I think President Biden, he'll go to the DMZ because every president goes to the DMZ. We'll see if North Korea manages to shoot off some more missiles while dealing with its now announced COVID infection. First time it's announced that they actually have some, but that certainly bears watching. I'm just skating over these things now, and signals that there's the Biden administration, has expectations of Korea to play this kind of role as the Biden administration is all about alliances, but we have expectations of allies, and they will go not only into the kind of security area that we traditionally think of in terms of working together closely on North Korea, strong deterrence, and so on, but also, as I said, things like semiconductors and technology chains, and how intellectual property is shared or not shared or protected. And this is where I think it's a pretty new area for everybody. It's certainly a very new area for me, and I'm not going to get too far into it. But for example, I think that there's probably a real desire, and I know there is on the part of the U.S. to see, South Korea, such an important producer of semiconductors, really kind of work extremely closely with the United States. With the United States pursuing something now, we have a kind of an industrial policy of how we're going to manage this kind of production and the technology around it. And notwithstanding the fact we have this great relationship, we're allies. I mean, these Korean companies are thinking, this is our stuff. This is our stuff. We want to make sure that we get the business right on this too. So it's, it's going to be something that bears watching, and it's not going to be all easy or all smooth. So I think I probably kind of talked long enough and to put you all a little bit to sleep here, but I really would like to just maybe I threw enough stuff out there, a little chum in the water there, and we can have a conversation.
Wow.
I've got a question for you, Kathy. I think is President Biden going to Japan as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's going to Japan as well. In fact, that was probably the kind of initial thing that he was going to do. And there, the notion is that he's going to have what they call a Quad summit. So I think if you haven't heard of the Quad, this is one of it's the kind of formal / informal grouping of democratic, I shouldn't use air quotes, I should, of democratic countries, not to contain China, but kind of contain China. Oh, we're recording this, so be careful. And it really was a Japanese idea. I mean, I heard it initially, which very successive American administrations, starting I think with the Bush administration, kind of took up in various forms. So right now, the Quad, I mean, it's 4 countries, is the U.S. It's a bit of a maritime thing too. The U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. So one of the questions for Korea is what should be his relationship with the Quad, and so on and so forth. But anyway, that's a long way of saying, yes, he's going to Japan, Quad Summit. I'm sure he'll have some bilaterals there, obviously, with the still relatively new Japanese prime minister as well, Mr. Kishida. And also on the agenda in both Tokyo and Seoul will be, I'm sure, President Biden expressing and trying to push forward in some way, but expressing his desire to see Japan and South Korea repair their relationship in some way and get on a better footing. Yoon has certainly said that he's ready to do this. Maybe there's some opening to do that, but that will definitely be an important part of the trip. But it's just the two countries, Japan and Korea, that he's going to.
I have a question. Just getting back to the campaign itself, prior to the election, I obviously didn't follow it nearly as closely as you and probably some others here. But my own reading of it was that Mr. Yoon had borrowed a few pages from Donald Trump in the way he conducted his campaign. That is to say, exploiting some of the dividing lines in Korean society, exploiting the frustrations that certain people in the country were experiencing, particularly along gender lines, but other areas as well. And given the very small margin by which he won, that might have been the winning strategy after all. I wonder what you might think about that, and whether he's in any position to follow through on those kinds of issues in the way that he may have offered in his campaign.
Yeah, I try to avoid comparing anybody to Donald Trump just because I think it leads my, I don't want to, but yeah, I mean, I do think we see throughout the world. I mean, these and again, populism means different things to different people. I don't know if I would call them a populist campaign, but certainly fanning a certain anger and discontent and kind of and scapegoating of groups, you know, and I do think that part of the backlash against the women's rights movement in Korea and against feminism was explicitly fanned, yes, by Mr. Yoon, because he getting the young men to vote for him was an important part of his strategy. The other thing that really worked for Yoon, and this was shown very much in the polling, is that I think going back, you know, Moon Jae-in came to power, you'll recall, with the downfall of Park Geun-hye in the sort of candlelight revolution, or vigil, we can call it revolution, but and, you know, off to prison, and then a kind of an off schedule election, and expectations were very high from Moon Jae-in, and as is the case of, I guess, every Korean president after 5 years, people are disappointed. That said, you know, Moon Jae-in actually left office with a relatively high approval rating, meaning about 40%, which is high for a departing Korean president. But anyway, I'm digressing slightly here. But what also was very clear in the polling throughout the campaign was, if you ask people, again, do you want to see a change of government, you know, 청권 교체, right? That was always really high. And so there really was just a sense of, it's time to get another party in office. Now, this is the first time since democratization, since 1987, that the party in power has not gotten two successive terms. So you know, had the party of Moon Jae-in, who and they also nominated this outside, you know, in a sense, an outsider, Lee Jae-myung, although he was a more traditional politician in some ways, had he won, that really would have consolidated the Minjudong as kind of as the establishment party. And it was a big surprise, I think, that the conservatives were able to come back, especially when they lost so badly in the National Assembly elections that were held 2 years ago, kind of at the height of the pandemic. So I think there were, you know, a lot of factors at work, but as the campaign went on, I think it was a combination of people just feeling like, we want to give the other party a chance, we want to get the conservatives back in, and yes, I do agree with you, Charles, though, trying to really appeal to this discontent among young men in particular. Did work for Yoon. That said, in the late days of the campaign, young women who also were very disillusioned with the opposition party, because there'd been so many scandals involving, rape and sexual harassment. I mean, it really had been pretty awful, and a lot of the, you know, governors and mayors had all kind of gone down. The mayors of Seoul, Busan, the governor of Chungcheongnam-do, all of whom were considered to be potential presidential candidates, had all left office and of course, the mayor of Seoul committing suicide over sexual scandals. So these young women didn't really feel like they had any particular party to vote for, but as the misogyny of the Yoon campaign really heated up, a lot of them did go and vote for Lee Jae-myung for the opposition candidate, which is one reason the margin of victory for Yoon turned out to be so narrow. Anyway, so yes, all that's kind of a long answer to say, yeah, we are left with Yoon with a very narrow margin. It'll be very interesting, I think, to see how things go in the local elections. Even though that's supposed to be detached from the national one, and we could well see a. I think it's expected that the conservative Mayor Oh and Seoul will win again, but clearly there's going to be some stiff opposition. But I think again, Yoon's going to try to do some things on the real estate. I don't know what he can do about it. I mean, real estate is high in Gangnam unless we really get it. And now we're being buffeted by and Korea itself by just the economic uncertainty we're all seeing of high energy prices, which of course hit Korea very high, inflation very hard, and inflation and the rest of it. The other thing that I think that could make Yoon really, and I mean, I hope this is not the case. I mean, we have to hope that he's going to succeed, but kind of stumble right out of the starting gate is what are his priorities? And one of the, again, I mean, I wouldn't say this in a more formal gathering, but I mean, one of the kind of really strange things that he did that I'm sure you've noticed, and again, people who've lived in Korea and know Korea like you all do and like we do, can see how strange this is he decided he wasn't going to move into the Blue House. And he decided he was going to, well, I mean, there were various places, but he ended up kind of taking over the Defense Department, and eventually he'll move into some house there. And the ostensible reason was, it was that the Blue House was too isolated from the people, and he wanted to be more open to the people. But in good Korean tradition, there were all kinds of rumors, and I think there's more than a grain of at least some kind of credibility to some of them, that there was that Yoon and his wife, and of course there's a lot of stories circulating about his wife. Again, this is Korean politics, but she is a very unusual figure that they had been told by a fortune teller, mudong, whatever, that no one whoever sleeps in the Blue House ever has a peace in life after leaving the Blue House. He should never ever put his head on a pillow there, and gosh darn it, he didn't. He didn't go into the Blue House, so he's moving over to Yongsan eventually. And in any event, I mean, this was kind of I thought this was a little bizarre, but it's mostly a matter of priorities. I mean, what are you going to do between in your first days, and this is what he chose to do. We'll see what else that he focuses on. I did notice, I mean, this is actually this will be coming up. Someone told me, I hadn't seen this, that Yoon is going on May 18th to commemorate Gwangju, the Gwangju uprising. He's going to Gwangju. This is very unusual, obviously, for a conservative president, especially to do it early. This actually indicates to me, and maybe this is a positive thing, that I don't think Yoon has any particular ideological stripe, right? I think he's pragmatic, I suppose you could say, but I think he's going to be a little bit unpredictable.
Can I just follow through? One of the things that I may be wrong about this, as I am about many things, my sense was that he was making certain promises, maybe promises too strong a word, that he was going to do something to right the balance between men and women. That is, to make the structural changes in the system such that men would have a better chance at competing with women who were getting too big for their britches and too far ahead of the game. Am I right about that? Did he sort of at least imply, if not outright say such things?
Well, he did.
Is there a chance in the world that he could possibly follow through on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he did say things along the lines that he didn't think that there was any, structural discrimination against women. So, and that you're right, that quotas and any favoritism given to women, that those things should be, I don't know if he said they should all be gotten rid of, but they should be looked at. What he did promise, Korea does have a ministry of, in
Right.
English, it's called the Ministry of Gender Equality. In Korean, it's called the Yosungbu or something, the Ministry of Women. But basically, it does look at things like discrimination against women, but also looking at the issue of Korea's negative birth rate and support for women who are victims of domestic violence, who are suffering the discrimination as single parents, so on and so forth. Now, he has not gotten rid of the ministry, and this may go to your point. He may not have a lot of room to follow through on all these things, and he may be, and perhaps some international attention to this will slow him down a little bit too. That I get a lot of questions about this now, and it's. Korea has. We all know that Korean women have still struggle. I would say under a heavy burden of whether you call it formal or informal, but all kinds of constraints and discrimination and challenges. Young women have not faced the discrimination that we saw when we were all in Peace Corps that women faced in education, and parents, and even the preference for sons, I think, is far less than it was a generation or two ago. So you have generations now of young, and now I mean by young women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, highly educated, and women who actually are a lot better at passing tests. So, they pass tests at a higher rate than men. They get in at a higher rate. In fact, so a lot of the quotas there are for men, that there have to be you have to be a minimum of 30% in a certain class, so there's all of that. But the main thing that you hear from the young men who say that they are facing this discrimination, and I was in Korea in December, and I was really shocked. I was kind of knocked back on my heels by young men who told me how awful Korean radical feminists were. I told them, well, I'm a feminist. So, well, you're not a Korean feminist. I said, you have no idea. So, but what they point to is, of course, compulsory military service. And the fact that this interrupts a young man's career progression. One can also argue that it helps their career progression in some ways, and the kind of networking and so on that is so important, as clearly when women start to try to combine career with family or family obligations, whether they're children or parents or anything else, find it almost impossible to manage. But that, nonetheless, I think is the main thing they point to. But interestingly, nobody's really talking about universal conscription or public service or something like that. It's just more a matter of this sort of women are getting too many favors now, and we should do something about that. So I don't know, it'll be very interesting. There's the very loud pushback against this too, but I think this is going to be a very lively issue in Korea for the next few years.
Would he be able to close down the Ministry of Women and Families without the consent of the Parliament?
Yeah, my impression is that he does need the consent of Parliament, of the National Assembly, right? Yeah, so that would clearly be a reason why. Yeah. So I think he's kind of wisely maybe decided he's just not going to deal with that one right now. But we'll see what they, what is budgeted and so on. One thing that how everyone feels when he says, and again, he's not unique in this, but he said, I'm only going to pick the best people, no more favoritism for anybody. And then, you look at the lineup of who's in his cabinet, and, it turns out the very best people in Korea are all Korean men in their 50s who went to primary school or middle school with him, or at least university, or was a prosecutor with him. So, it is a little discouraging.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what role the press plays in Korean politics and in government. Is it a free press, or is it tightly controlled?
No, I would say the press is not, and others may have views on this too, not tightly controlled. And presents a range of opinion. I think that there is a lot of kind of not even exactly censorship, but there's within the kind of the mainstream press, if you like, there's a lot of things that go underreported or unreported, especially when it comes to some of the relationships, for example, between business and government. And there are some pretty, and there's been a lot of controversy about this, but I mean, there are some laws on the books that do make it a little bit risky for journalists to write things that may subject them or their owners, their papers to lawsuits and such. But no, I think it's a relatively lively press environment. I mean, the other part of it now, of course, which is the social media part, right? I mean, that's just kind of booming. And I think that South Korea does suffer the virus that we all do of a lot of misinformation as well. And South Korea is such a still tightly bound, tightly wired instant communication kind of thing that these that a lot of false so-called, again, I don't like to use the word fake news, but a lot of false things and rumors spread around, but also some things that are true as well. But I think it is having the effect of eroding some of the sort of confidence in the institutions or in even what is really fact that I think we've seen around the world, including in our own country. The new, I can say one of the very few women who's not exactly the press, but one of the very few women with a senior position in the new Yoon administration is a woman who was worked for Chosun Ilbo as a conservative newspaper, and she was the chief correspondent here in Washington for a while. Gang In-sun is her name. She's very good. She's very bright, rigorous, and the quality is very high. So I actually take some. I think that's a good sign. I think she'll be an honest voice.
Thank you.
The papers with the biggest circulation are the Donga Ilbo, the Chungang Ilbo, and the Chosun Ilbo, I think, and they are all very conservative.
Yeah.
And then there's the Hangare Shinmun and I think the Pyongyang
Shinmun, and Hungary does pretty well. Yeah. No, and Chosun Ilbo is certainly very conservative, and no, I mean there definitely was it was interesting. I mean a feeling in Korea. Well, I mean some of it again is generational. I would go back to the kind of the generational analysis that that people in their 60s in Korea. And I guess we're all in our 60s or older, and that generation tends to really support the Conservative Party. I mean, obviously not everyone, and there are regional and ideological divides, but there's a pretty heavy generational lean that way. People in their 40s and 50s, many of whom really do identify with the democratization movement of the 80s. Still tend to, and again, it's not by like 90% to 10%, but sort of 60-40 or something like that, lean, but pretty heavily towards the Progressive Party. And then it's the younger ones who are really kind of still up for grabs and have gone back and forth, really supported Moon Jae-in, felt a little bit kind of, let down because he did not address some of the issues that they've seen their lives become more difficult, they feel, during his term, and moved again with this push from the to get the male vote out, move towards the conservative camp. But I think they're still up for grabs.
I think we could say that the press is definitely not controlled in the way it is not controlled. I think the conservative press is conservative because that's their ideology. Yeah. And the Hangare Shinmun and the Gyeonghang Shinmun publish what they want to publish, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, so the editorial content, you see a very clear editorial view. I mean, as you would here between, the Wall Street Journal and, the New York Times or something, this is within a certain spectrum, but it's just more in the kinds of stories that they report. I I don't see as much range as I'd like to see on some of them personally, but you know, that I'm not their audience, I guess. And I do think that again, the Koreans have moved so much, I mean, even more than we have, to sort of digital and you know, other means of getting their news. And you know, YouTube's very big.
Well, okay, just following through on something you just said, Kathy, and reflecting back upon the campaigns of the two candidates. To what extent, other than playing on the grievances, was there an attempt to actually address these problems of inequity and jobs, the real estate problem as well? Were there any practical solutions being offered and differences between the two campaigns as far as that goes? And is there any realistic possibility that these would be workable solutions that could actually be put into place in the current administration?
Well, I think certainly the feeling of the Korean electorate was probably not, but that these were problems that kind of no one really had a solution to. But what Yoon tried to do was, and I think he had a certain success with this, is try to take, if you like, a more kind of classical conservative approach that we need to deregulate, you know, that the Moon administration did, you know, to impose too many new requirements on for small and medium businesses, for example, when it came to things like minimum wage, trying to improve the lot of temporary workers by regularizing, but all things that were a greater intervention by government that put additional costs on businesses. And Yoon said he would roll some of those back and free the market up to try to create more jobs and more opportunity. But when it comes to the housing issues, I mean, that is such a perennial. I mean, what I've seen now about housing and other is that I think the hope is just that the overall cooling economy, you know, may have, you know, some impact on the kind of the craziness of what's happened with the housing prices. And again, it's essentially housing prices in a certain part of Seoul, because the other, you know, issue is that no government, every government, and even before democratization, right all through the time, has really been able to deal with is the Gregory Henderson vortex, right, of Seoul, of money and capital and ambition all moving to Seoul and trying to disperse, if you like, some of the economic gains and opportunities elsewhere in the country. And it just seems to be, you know, impossible. I mean, they built Sejong City, which is supposed to be, you know, the new capital. And they still can't get, it's like Naypyidaw, well, I shouldn't say it's like Naypyidaw if you've been to, but I mean, they, you know, people that work there, but they keep their families in Seoul, and, you know, you'll all be able to know the reason, because they're convinced that's where that if their kids don't go to school in Seoul and don't go to school in certain districts in Seoul, that they're like, you know, doomed for life. So, so it's just a very, very difficult thing. And no, I think there's a lot of skepticism that Yoon will be able to do it. But, you know, we'll see. I mean, I don't want to sound too negative about it, because I think that he's bringing in an experienced team, and actually a team that has worked for progressive governments as well. The prime minister designate is Han Duck-soo, who was Roh Moo-hyun's prime minister. Is from Cholla. He hasn't been confirmed yet, because he's gotten in trouble because he kind of did the revolving door thing and made money when he was out of office. But you know, there's I don't think there's huge differences in the approaches that Yoon, or for that matter Lee Jae-myung would take. You know, Lee Jae-myung, who was the opponent when he ran, he started a kind of a province-wide universal basic income for young people in Gyeonggi-do, and that was very popular. And for a while, he was called the Korean Bernie Sanders, and calling him the Korean Bernie Sanders is probably about as I don't know, as misleading as maybe, or helpful as calling Yoon the Korean Donald Trump. But you know, there is that sort of sense that they represent a somewhat different approach. But in practice, I think we're going to have to wait and see what that really plays out to be.
Kathy, switching over to.
Bobby has something too, but yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Switching over to North Korea for a minute.
Yeah.
what insights do you have about what kind of approach he's going to have with that issue? Is he going to continue what Moon did, or is he going to change? What do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the tone is going to change. I mean, but first of all, I mean, I would say about Moon Jae-in, that what Moon Jae-in, I mean, certainly Moon Jae-in came from a political tradition and his own mind that wanted to see engagement with North Korea, wanted to try to, and actually every Korean president, at least on their own terms, wants to see that. Every Korean president wants to be the one who achieves a breakthrough. But Moon Jae-in's, I think, North Korea policy was shaped by Donald Trump. Moon Jae-in dealt with a Donald Trump who came very close to starting a war on the Korean Peninsula, evacuating all the Americans there, and then flipping to this policy of top-down engagement. So I think Moon Jae-in, to some extent, was trying to ride that. Well, I don't know if to call it a tiger, but ride that this very, very unprecedented kind of approach that Trump was taking, and felt for a while he was doing it successfully because they were, having this opening that was starting and a moratorium on testing and the rest of it, and it all came crashing down. So, but a lot of that was I think, again, in response to trying to deal with the set of circumstances that we were in those years as with the Trump administration. So coming out of that, again, I think Yoon is going to have a policy that's going to be actually quite similar in Koreans to Lee Myung-bak, who was president when I was ambassador in Korea, and those were the years when we saw the start of the transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, and the sinking of the South Korean Coast Guard vessel, the shelling of Yeongpyeong-do, and so on. And Yoon has brought in essentially the same advisors, the same North Korea advisors that Lee Myung-bak had. And Yoon has essentially outlined what Lee Myung-bak has, which is basically, if North Korea denuclearizes, we'll give you all kinds of economic benefits. But if it doesn't, we're going to have a strong defense and deterrence policy. So I think that's what he's going to do. I think for now, now we've got North Korea announcing the presence of COVID-19. To date, it's refused vaccines, but I see the Yoon administration has already said we're prepared to send vaccines if they change their minds. So I think Yoon will look for some opportunity to engage. He will make a real point of saying that he's going to coordinate closely with the United States, not have any distance between them. But I think there will be a real question of what happens if North Korea does stage some kind of, sometimes called provocation or attack, as happened 10 years ago. And would Yoon be inclined to try to respond to that rather aggressively? So I think that's one question that is out there. That we may see, and I worry about that a little bit. And the other thing is, and this again would apply across the board, but within the kind of conservative political spectrum in South Korea, there are growing voices that saying there should be a return of U.S. deployed so-called tactical nuclear weapons of the Korean Peninsula, given the increased North Korean threat, and/or that Korea should develop its own nuclear deterrent, given doubts about American commitment. Yoon has not explicitly, lined up at least with those voices, but he will hear from those voices as president. I think it was Bobby had.
Yes.
Hand up.
Here in Tokyo, when Yoon was elected, the mood seems to be that Japanese-Korean relations will improve. And in Japan, when they talk about that, that means that Korea will give in on the comfort women issue and the wartime workers reparations and stuff. I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But can you see how they could improve relations in other ways, given Japan's conservative parties.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated and difficult kind of domestic political issue in both countries. But I think now that, there's a relatively new prime minister in Japan, now the new president in Korea. I mean, I think that there is room to the relationship has gotten so bad. There's room to at least bring it back to an area where they are cooperating together quietly, and not just with the United States, but with with other countries in the region on a whole variety of things, whether it's vaccines or maritime security or supply chains or the rest of it. And I think that Biden will really push for that. So I think it's certainly possible we'll see Kishida and Yoon at some point, maybe with Biden having a meeting saying, but it's going to continue to be a little scratchy, I think. And I don't think that Yoon is going to. I don't think any Korean president can really go to the Korean courts and say, you got the decision wrong, we're going to ignore it now. I mean, it's poses the same problem we would have in this country to do that. But I expect to see some modest improvement. Again, short of something else happening. The other thing where the reason that Yoon may have a little more space within Korea is I think that again, back to the generations, that Koreans in their 20s and 30s are a little bit less feel a little bit less strongly about these issues, and may be a little more tolerant of some compromise. But yeah, the Japanese are going to have to do something. I mean, that's the problem. It's kind of one of these, something positive.
Lots of work.
Yeah, I know. And then you get a new textbook out, and we're right back to it. But yeah.
I was interested in your comment about the semiconductor industry in Korea. And does it have a particular thrust, or is it closely tied in with the American high-tech industry, or does it have a thrust in defense or in automotive or
everything? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just everything. I mean, I guess I should have these figures on hand, but I mean, it turns out that I mean, these foundries where they make these semiconductors, these foundries, they're really expensive to build. They take a long time to build them. And Taiwan or South Korea are kind of like the only countries that really built them, right? And of course, Samsung has one in Austin. I visited, and they're going to build another one. And a couple of other companies, Korean companies and Taiwanese companies, are going to build some in the U.S. and are getting a lot of, tax support and other benefits from local states and so on to do that. But it takes time. But no, I mean, in the meantime, these. The semiconductors go to make chips for everything, just everything. So it really is kind of astonishing that that Korea has kind of happens to have and Taiwan, one of the industries that is really the linchpin of the supply chain.
And China has such interest, shall we say, in Taiwan. That presents a real global problem.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's another thing to watch. And I don't have anything really sort of very insightful to say about anything, but about Taiwan. But it's worth watching the kind of the South Korea-Taiwan relationship as well, which is not. I mean, South Korea is pretty careful not to get too involved in things related to Taiwan because of Chinese sensitivities. But for example, last year when then President Moon had a meeting with President Biden, they put out a long joint statement. And for the first time, that joint statement actually made a reference to Taiwan. Again, South Korea usually kind of avoids that, but it's, I think that there's an expectation, whether there should be on the part of the United States, that South Korea will be more like Japan and be a little bit more forward-leaning and underscoring the fact that we're paying attention to what's to Taiwan, that we it gets into Taiwan policy as and would would be very unhappy to see some changes there. So, and as you know, the Chinese are just very neuralgic about that. So that's something to really watch, I think. And I guess related to that, I haven't really talked very much about, or not at all about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that's viewed in Korea and all the rest of it. But and that's obviously the issue that has consumed the Biden administration for the past couple of months, and well, really the world. And Korea in the first instance was perceived in Washington as, and this is under the Moon government, as being again, a little slower than the Japanese. I don't think they should always be kind of compared to the Japanese, but in some quarters of Washington they are, but a little bit slower than the Japanese in joining with European nations and other like-minded partners and imposing sanctions on Russia. But in the event, I mean, South Korea did, and is lined up pretty clearly with EU and NATO and others in imposing sanctions on Russia. But it comes obviously at a great cost to Korea, as it is in terms of worry about its energy supplies, worry about. I think it's kind of an historical thing too. I mean, the Koreans, remember that Russia's played an important role in the Korean Peninsula too, and they still have hopes of pipelines and all kinds of things. But I think they realize that this has been, it's just. It's such an important geopolitical moment, and when it comes to public opinion, I think certainly in Korea there at least has been a considerable amount of public opinion has looked and say, wow, if Russia can kind of get away with doing that in Ukraine, what's going to stop China from doing that not only in Taiwan but on the Korean Peninsula? So there's sort of a sense, I think, that it is an important time to kind of, and I think Yoon will follow up to kind of stand with the U.S. and the rest of the world on it.
In Korea, are they seeing the same kind of inflation that we are in the United States? So how does
not
that
as high, but they are seeing inflation, and the won is dropping. Of course, I mean that makes their trade. I mean, they were doing all right. They just started to really worry this last couple of weeks, especially about the supply chain things, and the energy costs. So I think the Bank of Korea or whoever does, they've reduced the expected growth rate for Korea in 2022 down to 2.5%. I think it was at about 3%. So and again, I mean that's not recession, that's still growth, but it's
pretty good.
Yeah.
I've heard it said that some people in South Korea are worrying about North Korea following the example of Russia's attack on Ukraine. It strikes me as a far-fetched idea. But supposedly the fact that we are not getting directly involved in Ukraine can be seen as raising doubt about whether we will get directly involved if something happens requiring the nuclear umbrella or defense action by the United States on the Korean Peninsula. I don't think that's
no, I agree. I mean, I have not heard exactly that from Koreans. What I would say if I did would be that the U.S. and South Korea have a security alliance, and we are committed to the defense of the Republic of Korea. What I have heard people kind of speculate about and think about, and this seems a little more plausible to me and a little more worrisome, therefore, is that North Korea and Kim Jong-un, when they see the example of, I mean, everyone's like, Ukraine gave up, if you like, its nuclear weapons in exchange for for guarantees of its sovereignty, and now those guarantees have turned out did not stop the Russian invasion. So lesson is, don't give up your nuclear weapons. And then corollary of that is the U.S. has been constrained from, I mean, whether we would or not anyway, constrained from a more direct engagement with Russia because Russia is a nuclear weapon state. Ergo, as long as North Korea has nuclear weapons, and they already believe this, or I think Kim Jong-un, they say they believe it, as long as they have nuclear weapons, they are much safer from a direct attack from the United States. The other thing, well, I said that I've seen, and actually I've seen in some Korean newspapers people write about, is in terms of kind of scenarios people think about, is would North Korea, if in the event of, as they call it in the government, a Taiwan contingency, right, meaning a war, and I mean China attacking Taiwan and attention going to the defense of Taiwan, would this be an opportunity? Would Kim Jong-un or the North Korean leader at that time see that as an opportunity to move south? So it certainly introduced that kind of speculation and thinking into, yeah, the discourse.
I have a question about the new president, Yoon, and the now opposition party. And I read the daily newspapers, both Hangul and also Chosun Chungang, sometimes Donga. And what we're seeing now is the opposition party seeming to, they have already approved most of Yoon's choices for his cabinet. Han Duck-soo is still sort of pending, but it appears from the newspapers, even in the Hangul, that the Minjudang is going to come around and finally approve them, probably. But what struck me about the examination of some of the candidates was that there's no question about people's background or capabilities, or in some cases experience, but all of the opposition to them, particularly to the new Minister of Health, Mr. Han, who was head of the hospital in Daegu, and it turns out his two children were, passed an examination there. And there's simply a focus on, almost like some parts of United States politics, doesn't matter whether somebody's qualified or not, but, did they give their children unfair advantages? And as you say, in a society where equality or simply access to the system is now open, but it's extremely difficult to get anywhere without connections, that seems to be a focus of much of the politics. So the question I have is, how is the opposition has a strong majority in the National Assembly, but they don't have a majority large enough to overturn a veto by Yoon. So how do you see, sort of in this dynamic, opposition politics, assuming that this next election isn't going to change very much in the National Assembly, maybe just a few seats? That is the election in June.
Right.
I'm just curious as to how you see this playing out. And Yoon, whatever his ideas and some of his populist or misogynist comments will be, is very inexperienced. And the concern I get from Koreans that I know is they sort of think maybe he has his heart in the right place and he wants to do the right thing, but he's going to be running into all kinds of problems with conservative elements as well as the Minjudang element. So that's a long, vague question, but interested to see how you see the dynamics working.
Yeah, actually, I see them much the way you described, especially on that last point. I think he is going to, as we were mentioning earlier, run into some issues with his conservative elements as well as the progressives, because I don't think he's strongly ideological and I do think there's going to be a tendency, I'm kind of working backwards on this, a tendency in this kind of environment and in Korean politics as a whole to kind of focus on scandals or investigation, as I mentioned earlier, of kind of past wrongs. So I think it is certainly possible the National Assembly could try to express its opposition or its unhappiness with the Yoon administration, not so much on policy issues where I don't think they have a lot of sway. I mean, they could stop certain things, but rather in investigations, and this is be very consistent with previous Korean politics of the previous administration, of the previous candidate, Lee Jae-myung. I mean, already people are saying, well, he's running to be in the National Assembly because it's one of the few ways he can semi-insulate himself from going to jail for investigations into what he did when he was Gyeonggi mayor, and some real estate scandal. But I want to also go back, but yeah, so on the National Assembly, I would say is certainly increased in influence and power over the last, I'd say, decade or so in Korean politics, but it still is a relatively weak body in terms of in relation to the strength of the presidency. So I think Yoon has considerable scope, but he's got to be careful about alienating public opinion. Again, in Korea, notwithstanding its democratic institutions, I mean, there is a legitimacy to and a power to street protest, which I think is one of the really salient things about Korean politics. And I know for those of you who are scholars, it goes back into, I guess, Chosun Dynasty or before, but I can see Yoon doing something that's probably over an issue of ethics or morals rather than maybe even policy or some that brings people out into the streets. Again, that's what I would see as one of his challenges. I liked your description. I think it was good of how how the candidates for the cabinet have been presented have mostly been criticized for their children getting into schools or getting benefits or getting jobs or whatever, and sometimes their spouses. I think it's this very kind of sense that the society's unfair. The question I hear, about fairness. I mean, I've always heard a lot about fairness, but the notion of fairness is very, very important. And there really is a sense among a lot of Koreans now, just a resentment that things have been really tilted and are terribly, terribly unfair. And for the Minjudong, I think they're also kind of getting a little bit of revenge because, in the latter days of the Moon Jae-in administration, you had the Choguk scandal, right, with this Minister of Justice nominee whose nomination was knocked down because of again, his children getting benefits and his family trying to get favor for his children. But it's a fascinating part, if I can say this, of Korean society in some ways. I'm always struck, and some of you may know that may be familiar with this too. When I tell Koreans about, I mean, I have my own views about it, but that in American universities are famous, at least have a system called legacy applicants, where you get a leg up if your mother or father, or hopefully even both, are alumni of that university. Koreans are just horrified. So absolutely would not happen here, and they it's just so competitive, as you all know, and there's just such hypersensitivity to anything that would give someone a leg up, even though, I mean, everyone does it, I guess. So, but I think Yoon is I don't expect his major challenges to be over huge policy issues. I think it's going to be over perceived lapses in ethical standards, and kind of think of the Korean word for it, not being an ethical leader. I think that's what he's going to have to watch out for, and that's what they'll. I think he can. When it comes to North Korea policy, or kind of being tougher on China, or closer relationship with the United States, there's actually a broad consensus for policy around all of that.
Excuse me, Kathy, we've had you on the hot seat for an hour and 20 minutes. Are you good for one more question?
Sure, yeah, I enjoy yours.
Okay, all right.
I've worn you all out.
Anybody have another
question? Speaking of ethical lapses, I seem to remember that there were some questions raised during the campaign about about you and his ethics. Am I right about that, or was it the other guy?
Mostly they had to do with his wife. I mean, this is
Okay.
where it gets very sticky too, right? That she had, she'd padded her resume. And then the wife's, his mother-in-law had, I think there was some kind of, again, this is just alluded to in the kind of the main press, and but that his mother-in-law had, made a lot of money in stock deals or so. Yeah, yeah. But for the others, I mean, there's just, it gets into, real estate, getting into schools, moving your kids to a different school district because they want them to go there, and changing your address. Sometimes, yeah, I mean, and back to real estate, it's always some combination. Yeah, you and I don't know. I don't remember, but maybe somebody else does, that there's been something, just mostly that he's just kind of an unknown person. So, we'll see. I mean, he's a prosecutor. I mean, I actually had said something, again, this is all, even though we're recording, kind of off the record as far as I'm concerned, but I had someone to say, hey, just, he's a prosecutor and he just like to go out every night and drink. So doesn't mean you can't do other things too, but I think it was kind of what you see is what you get kind of thing.
One more question and we'll let Kathy go.
You don't have to.
I don't
Well, it's
wanna-
great to see you all.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, it was really interesting.
And has a question.
Kathy.
Well, yeah,
Wait, I've got one more question.
hey.
May have said that in the beginning, but what are you doing now?
So I'm in Washington and yeah, still doing Korea. So I head up the KEI, the Korea Economic Institute here in Washington. And I'm also on the board, or I chair the board of the Korea Society. So still doing all things Korean. So I'm going to Korea in June for 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to that. And try to, you talk about Korea so much, you have to get over there every once in a while, see people, right? So trying to write on a few
What's the
projects.
COVID situation like in Korea now? Can you
Well,
sum
they had
that up?
a really big spike, mostly not, very high vaccination rate. So the mortality rate has stayed thankfully very, very low, but a big spike in infections. But basically it's gone down now. They've lifted a lot of the restrictions. There's not that many quarantine restrictions now, but still a pretty and even the masking regime is not as strict as it is. So it seems like they're at least determined they're going to kind of come out of it. But I think the thing to watch, and again, I'm sure some of you are following this more closely, is China still worries me a lot. I mean, it's just, to have Shanghai locked down the way it is, and I mean the vaccination rate there obviously is very, very low. And then and let's see what happens in North Korea. If it really spreads, I mean, North Korea is an unvaccinated population. If it really spreads through there, I mean, the DMZ may be a pretty tight border, but we still know it's gonna. I think it could really impact South Korea. So that's also something to keep watching.
Well, thanks, Kathy. It was really interesting.
Thank you again.
Thank you. 말이 너무 많아요. 죄송합니다.
No, it was really interesting.
Go ahead.
Thanks for joining us. I'll if you'd like to be on our mailing list in case.
Oh, I'd love to.
Sure, we'll put you on the mailing list, but I think it was Ed Baker assured you that you're not required to attend, only if you want to.
No, I'd love to. If it makes me an honorary K1.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Mark Peterson asked for that privilege to be an honorary.
Absolutely.
We granted it. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Carl is exercising that privilege.
Okay. I'll
Right.
do that. Thank you.
If the
Okay,
one
so
freedom
thanks
allows
again.
me in K1.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
You all look great. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.
Okay.
Wow.
No. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Irene.
Yes, Irene too. Mhm.
Thank you. I know,
Oh, Diane is here. I hadn't seen Diane. She was here. I just saw her face and she
She
disappeared.
came on a little late, I think, but then she was there.
He was there.
Thank you, Frank. That's awesome. I wasn't here last time. Did you guys talk about taking a break during the summer?
Not yet. And
Okay.
we shrunk down to, there's like 6 of us now. But that's something we ought to consider. Do you remember when we took the break last summer?
I don't really, but summer is summer and people will go.
So just off the tops of your head, what would be the best time to take a break? Like from mid-July or July and mid-August or what?
I kind of feel like it was mid-July to mid-August or mid-July to the end of August. It's
Yeah.
maybe, it's so great. And I just hate missing if I ever have to. And you've just put together such great
Well, I sent you the link to the last one you missed because
You did, yeah, and I'm
you're
sorry.
on
Yeah.
my favorites list, so.
No. But I don't know, what do other people think in terms of summer?
I
Who
mean,
do
to
we
me,
have talking? Do we have people set up for talking in 2 weeks?
we have people set up until I think, okay, this is just among the 6 of us, okay? But Cliff Menniken wanted to do something on Korea. And a couple people thought that Cliff's views are really radical on Korea. I don't know about his views. So anyway, he enlisted Alan Taylor in his defense, that he was saying, hey, I want to give a presentation too, and Alan's going to do it with me. So that's the last one. It's June 25th. That's the last one scheduled, is June 25th. And that's, as some of you probably know, that's Korean War Day.
Oh, June 25th.
Yeah, very apropos. But anyway, Alan Taylor, who's a great guy, and Cliff, I don't know Cliff quite that well, but Cliff's, anyway, they're going to do something about US-Korean relations. I was sort of disappointed they weren't here tonight. It would have been interesting for them to, hear what Kathy had to say, but I don't think either of them were here. So we have coming up, we have Don Baker. I don't know if any of you know him. 2 former Korean volunteers. Don Baker is at the University of British Columbia. He's a big expert on Korean religion, Confucianism, you name it, Christianity and Catholicism. I think he's chosen to talk about why are there so many dang Christians in Korea? I think that's what he's going to talk about. And then
Dang missionaries.
well, of course, they don't even say dang, maybe, I don't know. But so, a nun once reproved me for saying gosh or something. It was too close to an inappropriate word when I was in 5th grade, I think. But anyway, and the other one is Don Clark, that some of you might know. And Don just retired from Trinity College as a Korean studies guy. And he's going to talk about he grew up in a missionary family. That's what we got, 2 kind of missionaries.
Oh, right.
He grew up in a missionary family. So he's going to talk about growing up as an expat in Korea, during political revolutions and so forth.
That's on the 28th of May.
I don't have the dates right here,
Two
but
weeks from now.
I think 2 weeks is Baker, 1 month is Clark, and then June 25th is Cliff and Alan, and 2 of our K1s. And that's what we have scheduled so far.
Chuck Hobby, I talked to, he's waiting on the sidelines. He was a lawyer for the Peace Corps for 25 years. Okay, 6 or 7.
Yeah, he put off, I think, a scheduling because he had something, maybe it was the Peace Corps reunion that he was involved in. But yeah, surely we can schedule him, as soon as he hasn't contacted me. I don't know if he's contacted. Usually Diane and I, we put both of our names, so we both see the correspondence, but I haven't seen anything from Chuck recently. But sure, yeah, we'd be happy, of course, to schedule him. And after we take a break, I don't think I've completely depleted my network, but I've done a pretty good job of it.
Yes.
In other words, I'm asking the last 6 people I've asked, most of them, I think. But I'm going to have to ask, people like you, Ed Klein, and others, to think of people, within.
What about Ed Klein? Did you ever clean your garage?
We already had one, Ed Klein. We had
2 of me.
2. It was a double session on.
It was because I talked so
I
slow.
missed it. Oh, crumb. Okay, never mind.
No.
Sorry.
You were here, but your eyes were closed. Sharon.
Isn't there a copy of it? Send her a copy of it.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
I can do that.
Oh, no. I remember it now. I do remember it. It's,
I told
it's
you
not
she
the
was
eyes, it's my memory. I remember because you talked about your classes. Yes, I
We were
remember.
talking about
Hey,
pigeon and different experiences.
I'm sorry. Please,
learning.
yeah,
Yeah, it was
Korean kids in Hawaii learning.
yeah, I do remember that. I'm
English
sorry.
or
I
pigeon.
remember.
But anyway, so I think we're pretty good up to at least close to some sort of summer break, and then after that, I'll put out a request for, because I think people like Ned Schultz and Dave McCann and so forth, they know lots of people that they could. Of course, we want someone friendly. We don't want anyone too
Charlie,
stuffy.
I'm sure Charlie Goldberg has a whole list of things that he can do.
Yeah.
Charlie is not short on ideas. Right. That's true.
So those ideas can wait until after the break. You have us up until June 25th. When do